all of the reporters were just like, yeah, that's okay. And we're just going to write that down and send it in our stories. I mean, when you look at it in that lens, this might be the greatest cover up in the history of the country. Good evening. Welcome to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM for Thursday, February 27th. I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RCP, joined tonight by Phil Wegman. He is our White House reporter, and Emily Jashinsky. She is the Washington correspondent for UnHerd. Uh, Guys, we've got some interesting news happening today, but I want to start with this idea, Phil. We've gotten a lot of information and stories coming out about various parts of the bureaucracy. One of the stories that came out, sort of this blockbuster, which we haven't talked about on this show this week, was Christopher Rufo, published in City Journal, these texts from the NSA, this private chat room that was full of all sorts of explicit sex talk from folks who were transgender and the like. Tulsi Gabbard apparently found out who these people were and fired 100 of these agents. And it's this idea that there's a lot going on at these agencies, Phil, that we're just now finding out about. And the NSA story is certainly the most shocking of the bunch.
And rewind to what we heard during Tulsi Gabbard's confirmation hearing, also what we heard repeatedly from Democrats during Kash Patel's battle on Capitol Hill. There was an argument that the incoming administration was going to politicize and weaponize bureaucracy, in particular the intelligence community. What we see as these leaks come out, we see this elsewhere with a lot of the work that DOJ is doing, is that the institutions that some of the opponents of the administration are trying to defend certainly do seem weaponized and politicized and less than efficient as it is already. I think this is going to add more fuel to the fire for folks like Elon Musk to say, we need to clean house and we need to do it quickly.
Emily, there was a follow-up story that Chris Rufo was published in City Journal, and it was a transcript between Chris Rufo and the whistleblower who apparently gave him the information. We ran it on Real Clear Politics this morning, and that also was, the way that this whistleblower described. He said there's a small cadre of folks that have captured that agency. It's been going on for a decade, and it's now deeply entrenched. Where these folks who were supposed to be basically doing analysis and writing reports to help protect the homeland are just mired in all sorts of woke, DEI stuff, like the, using pronouns and all this stuff. I mean, it really sounded, I read that and I thought, my gosh, they've completely lost the plot.
Yeah, I mean, it's all fun and games until this type of ideology creeps into the NSA or the CIA or one of those places. The FAA is another example of something where it's sort of startled people to see the way that these organizations are run ideologically. But just back to the NSA and the Rufo story, I mean, the way these conversations are completely inappropriate in any workplace unless you work in, like, I don't know, academia or in like actual, like, the sex industry. These are such inappropriate. If folks haven't read the story, they have to check it out because the transcripts are unbelievable. It's just inappropriate, let alone something that was deemed to be actually furthering the mission of diversity, equity, inclusion within our government. So it wasn't just that this is something that was tolerated. It was actually something that was done under the auspices, according to Rufo's reporting, of equality. And that's how these things were weaponized to completely corrupt institutions. There was, I mean, I think if you're reading this, I'm an armchair psychiatrist in this case, but there's clearly mental illness involved in the way people are communicating in these chats, and it makes you rather nervous. The level of severity of the work that they're doing, the level of security involved in the work that they're doing. So finally, there are people who are actually, working to get rid of this.
Yeah, and the whistleblower told Chris Rufo there's a strong sense of like Marxism and hatred for America, and they're working in an agency that's supposed to be protecting America. That doesn't. It's kind of hard to square that circle. All right, Phil. The other story that grabbed my attention and that is related is this idea that James Comey authorized as part of the Crossfire Hurricane investigation some female agents to be quote unquote honeypots, right? Which again, this was a story that I think the Washington Times broke in maybe October of last year, but it's bubbled to the surface again. Is that the kind of thing that the FBI should be doing for an investigation where they're investigating, in this case, the president? Well, he was, I don't know if he was the president-elect at that point, but certainly, you know, at one point he became the leader of the free world.
I was under the impression that U.S. law enforcement didn't use honeypot agents because of all of the normal ethical concerns that would come with that, let alone use them to, it sounds like, according to this whistleblower, try and entrap individuals on the Trump campaign. And I think the reason that this is coming to the light once again is because there was an allegation that was reported to Congress. Now you have Kash Patel and Pam Bondi who say that they're going to be getting to the bottom of this. But this is the type of example that the Trump administration is delighted with. Yes, they're angry and furious that this was targeted at them, allegedly. But I think that this is the type of example that they can point to anytime their critics say that they're running roughshod over the bureaucracy, because the White House is going to respond by saying, what institution are you trying to preserve? It needs to be torn up root and branch, and we need to fix things if someone who pretended that they were the last Boy Scout in Washington, James Comey, was willing to stoop to such lows and really weaponize the FBI. And this clearly seems to be a case of politicization and weaponization. It's an allegation right now. I'll wait for more details until later, but this is something that delights the Trump White House.
Emily, what'd you make of this news? I mean, it is obviously when you have, sex involved or the prospect of people trying to be manipulated via sex, it takes the story, it makes it more salacious, and grabs more attention.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I have two takeaways. One is that this is how desperate back in 2015 and then 2016 people in the intelligence agencies who were connected to high profile figures in the Democratic Party, the DNC and Mark Elias, as they were funneling. We know now that Christopher Steele, the FBI, had some degree of coordination with folks in those circles. They all agreed that this was, it was like a desperate situation to keep Donald Trump away from the Oval Office. And we remember, everyone remembers the Peter Strzok text message about the quote unquote insurance policy to Lisa Page, both high ranking FBI officials at the time. And so I think this is the second point, why there was also such a desperate effort. People wonder, like, how did Biden get so far and then just disappear from the ticket when it became obvious that he was impaired? It's like, because people knew that what was coming in is not a Republican administration that is just going to kiss and make up with the careers at the FBI. They knew that some of the stuff was going to be vigorously investigated. And this is, I mean, we're finding this out, a month into the Trump administration. There's just so much more where this came from. I'm sure they've done a good job of getting rid of some of the records, but there's so, or maybe there were no records to begin with, but there's so much more where this came from because of that desperation to keep Trump out of office, which then became desperation to keep him out of office again to cover the tracks.
Yeah, I feel like we're going to be learning a lot more as Tulsi Gabbard and Kash Patel and some of these other folks dig into what's been going on. I think this is not the the last story, or perhaps even the most shocking story that we're going to learn. Phil, we've got a couple minutes left, and the other thread I want to pull here is, we had a piece from Byron York of the Washington Examiner on the site talking about Charles Littlejohn. He was the leaker at the IRS. He leaked all the tax returns. Now, this is a bit different because he was a contractor. He was working for a consulting firm, Booz Allen Hamilton. He contracted to work for the IRS. He worked for them for a while. He left. He came back apparently with the explicit intention of getting Trump's tax returns and leaking them to the New York Times, which he did in advance of the election. But also now we're learning leaked, I guess the IRS sent letters to over 400,000 people who, individuals and businesses whose information was improperly leaked. As many people will remember, and maybe some people won't know, Charles Littlejohn was charged with one count of illegally leaking this information and was sentenced to I guess, the maximum, which was 5 years in prison. What do you make of that? I mean, certainly that's not how that's not how I think it would have been. It would have gone down if this had been, you know, let's just say a Republican who was leaking information against the Democratic administration. Would they have gotten one count, Phil, or would there have been perhaps a little bit more?
I think there might have been a temptation to drop the hammer a bit more. And that's speculative on my part, but think about the three stories that we're discussing today. The malfeasance at the NSA, the allegations of a honeypot at the FBI, and now this IRS leaker. If you're someone who thought that Donald Trump was going to be destroying norms, these three stories make it kind of difficult for you to look back, not just at the last 4 years of Biden, but the last decade and say that things were on an even keel previously. Again, I mean, these are going to be the counterexamples that folks like Elon Musk and Doge point to say, no, our work is justified.
Emily, you get the last word here, but I mean, to Phil's point, there is, and Elon Musk has talked about this. There's this entrenched bureaucracy, votes 95% for Democrats, and seems like it is they feel obligated or somehow morally uh, obligated to go after particularly Donald Trump.
We had Victor Davis Hanson over on UnHerd recently, and you guys all kindly republished the interview, but he made an important point that caught my eye because Elon Musk actually reposted Victor Davis Hanson making this point elsewhere about how this is, quote, a counter revolution. And that is essential because the left loses its ability, Democrats lose their ability to argue that this is just purely a revolution, that this isn't a reaction to sort of decades of corruption that's stacked up in the bureaucracy and in the administrative state, when we have all of these examples to point to that prove, you know, whether you agree that there needed to be a counter revolution or not, it is very, very clearly countering something. It is responding to something. And that is huge political ammunition for Republicans right now, as bureaucrats are out on the streets with their boxes and their ferns saying, well, what happened? You know, I was just trying to do what was best for the country. And you can point to 100 people at the NSA talking about sex positions in a group chat at work in the name of equity. I mean, it's a very potent weapon.
All right, we are going to leave it there for this segment. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back with more Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM right after this. And we are back. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM. I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RCP, joined by Phil Wegman. He's our White House reporter, and Emily Jashinsky. She is the Washington correspondent for UnHerd. Phil, let me start with you. This segment, this subject, which is Jake Tapper has a new book out, and it is about the cover-up of Joe Biden's mental decline. It's called Original Sin, and the cover has a picture of Joe Biden's with his hands covering his face, and Tapper and Alex Thompson of Axios worked together on this book for the last few months. They said they've interviewed 200 folks, and this is the quote unquote real story about what went on inside the White House and the efforts that and the lengths that people went to cover up Joe Biden's mental decline. He's been roasted on social media for in one clip in particular that was in 2020 where he was talking to Laura Trump, and she mentioned Biden's mental decline, and he absolutely excoriated her and shamed her and you know, completely shut her down. But there have been other instances along the way, and so he's being called a hypocrite, among other things, for participating in the cover-up and then writing about the cover-up and profiting coming and going. Your thoughts?
Well, to start, I think that Alex Thompson at Axios is probably the most right man in Washington, because there have been some clips that have been recirculated of him sort of dismissing Republican allegations that the president was slipping in terms of his mental acuity. But Alex Thompson was one of the more aggressive reporters on the beat, and he did not shy away from reporting some of these significant changes. I find the title of the book itself ironic, because up until that Atlanta debate, when Jake Tapper sat behind the moderator's desk, no one in polite society in Washington, D.C. would have described what was happening to President Biden as a cover-up. But clearly, after the course of that hour and a half long debate that the White House tried to say, he just had a cold, it wasn't his best night, it became very clear that the line that we were being given, what Karine Jean-Pierre told me when she said that he was as sharp as ever, just was not accurate. The president clearly was slipping. And so my expectation is that if this is going to be a real exercise in journalism that merits the work that Alex Thompson put into it, that there should, in all likelihood, maybe on the first page, be a mea culpa from Jake Tapper, who seemed to have gotten the story wrong, and also chastised others who raised the question about the president's mental acuity. So haven't read it yet, but I will. I think a lot of people at home, though, as they see clips circulate from this reporting, they're going to ask, why didn't I know this when Biden was in office? Why am I learning this now?
Emily, I mean, that's really, I think the hinge point of this whole thing was that debate, because at that point, even the folks in the media who had, again, downplayed and dismissed any time that anybody brought up, and the clip with Jake Tapper was, oh, it's a stutter, oh, it's, um, that no longer flew. And that's when Alex Thompson, who I agree with Phil, I mean, he was probably the one that most prominent who was on TV talking about this issue. But that was all sort of post debate, or a lot of it. Meanwhile, we have heard that people knew about this. I mean, there have been reports. The Wall Street Journal story that came out a little bit after the election said this was people were commenting on this who were meeting with Biden right after he took office. I mean, we're talking January, February 2021, where they walked away and said, "Wow, he's not the Joe Biden that he used to be." So, mea culpa from Jake Tapper, I don't see it. Do you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see it either, because the reason we remember Alex Thompson for being one of the better reporters on this question is because he was an exception for a really long time. And at one point, after the debate, the floodgates opened. It kind of became okay for people like Jake Tapper to ask these questions, but it was truly exceptional every time Alex Thompson just sort of dared to question whether Biden's health was as sterling as we were being told that it was. And my theory of the case is really just that Alex Thompson had probably a pretty good book, but when you can add to it the story of the first debate from behind the scenes, from a high profile person at CNN, you're probably able to sell more books. And honestly, if Jake Tapper were smart, he would know that the way to sell more books would be to actually have a mea culpa, to Philip's point, because that's what people want from the media right now, is complete transparency, at least the pretense of transparency, that, hey, man, I got this story wrong, so it would feel more authentic. But if he's going to continue to be dishonest about his record, this book is going to land like a lead balloon. And none of this, by the way, is looking so far in the past. The reason that people right now aren't believing the legacy media's reports about, things that Doge may or may not be doing wrong, things that Musk may or may not be doing wrong, is because they were lied to for so long about Joe Biden, that there was a cover up for so long about Joe Biden. That looms very large in the public's imagination. So good luck trying to convince people of things happening in DC when you covered that up for more than a year.
I mean, Phil, when you sort of broaden the scope and open the aperture here, I mean, this is the problem. It's a bigger problem for the media, and B, the idea, okay, that obviously Democrats are going to circle the wagons around Biden, okay, but the idea that the entire media complex would just go along with that, and take these things at face value. This, oh, Joe Biden's up at 8 a.m. He does more. He's sharper as a tack. He does more before breakfast than most people do in a day. I can barely keep up with them, like that kind of stuff. And all of the reporters were just like, yeah, that's okay, and we're just going to write that down and send it in our stories. I mean, when you look at it in that lens, this might be the greatest cover up in the history of the country in terms of a political scandal, and what was not told and shielded from the American people by the media itself.
So I covered President Biden when he was in Iowa and the Democratic caucuses, and then later South Carolina. I saw him work the rope line, and there were legitimate moments where you could see the old Biden shine through. He was excellent at creating a personal connection one-on-one with individuals. And then at the White House, it seemed during at least the first year that there were just good days and bad days for Biden. You know, one moment he would stutter and sort of meander in his remarks, and then the next he would be delivering a State of the Union address, which was pretty powerful. But I think to Emily's point, the Atlanta debate changed that. Now, I think to your larger argument about the press, it is very interesting because this book is coming out at a moment when you have reporters at the White House who are up in arms over what the Trump administration is doing to the pool rotation, to access to the president, and certainly what seems like a violation of the spirit of the First Amendment. But the American people don't have the press's back right now. Why? Because they're under the impression that the press lost its mind during the first Trump administration and then went on vacation during the Biden administration. So for this book to come out after the fact, I'm sure there's a lot of excellent reporting in it, and I'm looking forward to reading it. But it's an indictment on our industry when you had the Wall Street Journal, who was out there alone taking flack from the administration for their early reporting. They had access, early reporting on sort of the president slipping, and the rest of the press corps, you know, going along with the rhetoric about how the videos that we saw of the president were just cheap fakes. And, you know, as you said, that he was as sharp as ever.
Emily, we got about a minute left, and I don't want to take up, I go on these, I could rant for an hour about this, but you mentioned the credibility of the media, and this is just another example. When you have the White House Correspondents Association leaving to go do a show on MSNBC, when you have the former press secretary while she negotiating her contract, while she's speaking from behind the podium, when you have
and NBC was getting exclusive interviews during that time.
Right.
When Politico's Washington bureau chief hosts a show on MSNBC for 5 years, serving in both roles, and nobody seems to give a shit about that. Is the institution itself just fundamentally broken and irredeemably broken?
I mean, it's hard to disagree with that because we've seen trust in media dip back to record low that it hit in 2017. Gallup has been tracking this every year for decades, and it's back at a record low. So if there was anything that was going to right the tide and actually restore trust in media, by the way, it's good that trust in media is low right now. I would be concerned if people had high trust in media right now. But of course, we should have a media that we can trust. We just don't. And if anything was going to right the ship, it would have been the host of Celebrity Apprentice winning the presidency over the former Secretary of State. And what we've seen actually is a devolution. It has actually gone back to as bad as it was when that happened. And that's really frightening. And I think it speaks to exactly what you just said, Tom, is like there's no awareness whatsoever. We'll probably see a slightly more left version of the head of the White House Correspondents Association when he's on MSNBC, but I actually think that'll probably be almost indistinguishable from the way that he covered the White House for Politico.
All right, we've got to leave it there. We're going to take another quick break. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM. We'll be back right after this. Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM. I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RCP. Joined now by Matt Podgorski. He is a pollster at M3. Matt, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Listen to you guys' show almost every day.
Appreciate that. Okay, well, you did a poll that's making some news earlier this week. I guess the poll was taken maybe last week, but on Brandon Johnson and his status as mayor of Chicago. What did you find when you went into the field and talked to Chicagoans?
So we poll pretty regularly in Chicago and Illinois, and then obviously around the country. And what we found here was totally unprecedented. In a fave, unfave, neutral, and never heard of option, Brandon Johnson received less than 7% favorable rating in the city of Chicago. And that's in a properly representative sample of a city where Trump got 20% of the vote in the last election. So unprecedented numbers. And I'll tell you, I've never seen numbers this low on an incumbent in any circumstance. And that includes Rod Blagojevich's worst numbers,
right,
and Mike Madigan's worst numbers. I've never seen anything like
who
it.
was just convicted of wire fraud and conspiracy of bribery.
It's unprecedented.
But I didn't see. Well, first of all, what's the margin of error on this poll?
Margin of error on this is under 3%. We had a big sample size, around 700, so under 3%. So yeah.
So theoretically, it could be as high as
11
9 or 10, or it could be as low as 3.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And I saw the memo, but you didn't provide partisan splits. So do you have the partisan numbers? Like, obviously, I think Republicans, to the extent there are a few Republicans in the city of Chicago, I guess, but what do independents think about Brandon Johnson, and how many Democrats view him unfavorably?
Yeah, so we did a very simple split this time. Instead of doing partisan, we just asked them who they voted for in 2024. And so Brandon Johnson's favorables amongst Trump's folks that admitted they voted for Trump were 1%.
Okay.
And those 1%, I think, are just messing with the poll. There's always that 1% who just like to mess with the poll. Of Kamala Harris voters, only 8% favorable, 75% unfavorable. So just atrocious numbers. And that cuts across all demographics: race, ideology, region, age, gender. I've never seen anything like it. And keep in mind, Tom, a couple of folks will, of course, try to poke holes in the messenger, right? And say, oh, it's a right-leaning firm. We know how to poll Chicago better than anybody. We were the ones who nailed the 2023 race, and we were the first pollster to have Brandon Johnson gaining traction and moving into the runoff territory. So it's not like we have some problem with Brandon Johnson as a firm. We're just calling it like we see it here, and these are nationally record-breakingly bad numbers.
And so what's the biggest gripe? I know I saw, again, in the memo that you released, and again, you can find that at RealClearPolitics or just about anywhere else, because this is, as I said, gotten some good national traction. You did word clouds of people, what they're, when they think of some of these candidates, Brandon Johnson, but also people who might potentially run against him, words that describe him. And the ones for Paul Vallis and Susana Mendoza, they were generally positive, and with Brandon Johnson, it was all negative. I mean, it was incompetent. It was really striking when you see it in that. So what are voters? What's their biggest problem with Brandon Johnson?
Yeah, I mean, as somebody who lives in Chicago, I try to to put some context into some of these numbers. Incompetent was the biggest word. Arrogant was a big word. I think one of the things you're seeing is first of all, it was a really rough election in 2023. People that voted for the 52+% that voted for Brandon Johnson in the runoff, they didn't like Brandon Johnson per se. It was, in their mind, a choice of a lesser of two evils. It was similar to the 48%, close to 48% that Vallis got. The runoff system is wrought with kind of the least of two choices. But I think what you'll find, and what you've been finding, is Brandon Johnson fell into the same trap as Lori Lightfoot, is they can't take the heat of the media. And they come across as very condescending, very arrogant, very defensive. I just don't think either of them were mentally or emotionally prepared for what this job is. This is a tough job, running the city of Chicago. And it's taken some really tough mayors in the past to hang in there and take the heat. And Mayor Daley was one of them, obviously, and Rahm Emanuel as well. But I don't think either of these two felt like they were given a fair shake. And as a result, you see that in their reactions and the way they talk to anyone who questions them.
We're speaking with Matt Podgorski. He is a pollster for M3 Strategies. We're talking about a new poll they just released on the mayor of Chicago. And obviously, Matt, the issues that are of importance to Chicagoans, it's kind of the same old story, but crime was far and away the number one issue, even more so than the economy and inflation, although those are still pretty major concerns. But Brandon Johnson, that seems to be falling short on that issue.
Yeah, he continues to, alienate first responders, and especially police officers and their families. And I think he's just sort of downplays the crime issue. The crime issue doesn't poll as high statewide in Illinois for obvious reasons, but it's a problem fairly unique to Chicago proper and the surrounding suburbs. And until somebody, even if it's just a signal, that they're taking crime seriously and they're going to back the police, and that they're going to work with the prosecutor's office and frankly the federal government now to address crime, just at least send a signal that you're taking it seriously. I think that would go a long way, and he's just absolutely refused to do that.
One of the issues is illegal immigration, and that registered, I think, about 20% in your poll, and that's like one of those main issues where you mentioned not working with federal government, and he's been very outspoken that Chicago is going to remain and retain its status as a sanctuary city, and he'll fight that one. That's a hill he's willing to die on.
Yeah, and he might just die on that hill. I mean, that is an issue in Chicago, as deep blue as it is, where it's 88% Democrat in some years and as low as 80% in others. That cuts across partisan lines, and especially with the more recent Central and South American migrants, it's visible. Everybody sees it. Every community is affected by it, and the voters have consistently said in polling they want this addressed, and they want funding for illegals, whether it's true illegal immigrants or whether it's asylum seekers that are temporarily in hiatus status. They want them deprioritized and defunded, and they want Chicagoans funded and prioritized first. And that's been clear in all polling across all demographics.
Matt, we've got just a couple minutes left. And I know you did a poll, I think just maybe a week prior, on President Trump and his standing in the state of Illinois and how people are viewing him and what he's done in his first 30 plus days in office, including how people are feeling about Elon Musk. Tell our listeners and our viewers what you found about Trump's standing in the state of Illinois.
Yeah, so we were unsure how they would play in Illinois, because nationally, what Trump's been doing with immigration, and to a lesser degree DOGE, has been fairly popular, definitely above water nationally. There's a cloud over Illinois that bucks that trend. DOGE was wildly unpopular right now in Illinois, and Elon Musk less popular than Trump even, like minus 20% favorable. I think part of what you're seeing is it's going to take a little time for some of the positive benefits of some of these federal spending reductions to go into place and folks to see the tangible benefit of that. So I think there's a curve there. I think if we get back out to the field in 8 to 10 weeks, I think those numbers will be a little bit better. But there's no denying it. This is still a state that overwhelmingly votes against Republicans statewide. A really, really good year for Republicans is the Republican nominee losing by 11. And that's what happened in Illinois. So I think that's mostly a reflection of that. And we're early in the curve, I think.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Matt Podgorski, pollster for M3 Strategies. Matt, thanks for joining us. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, Tom. Take care, guys.
All right, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM after this.
Welcome back to the show. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief, Real Clear Politics. Talking now with Jonathan Rauch, writer for The Atlantic, and one of those provocative thinkers you'll find in American politics today. I've known John for years. We were decades, really. We were colleagues at National Journal, and I was covering the White House, and John was a must-read then, and he still is today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Carl. It's good to see you.
So you're writing about President Trump, where we're a month in, and this is like a fire hose of stuff that he's doing. And people are saying he's an authoritarian. People are saying this, that, and the other thing. You used a word I'd never even heard before in your essay in The Atlantic, patrimonialism, to describe the kind of administration that Donald Trump is bringing to Washington. Why don't first of all, just describe that to us, and then we'll have a conversation about that.
Well, patrimonialism is a word I hadn't heard either, and I've been covering politics now and government for 40 years, but it's an old word. It goes back to the German sociologist Max Weber 100 years ago. It was the predominant form of government in the whole pre-modern era, and that's when the leader effectively owns the state. Like the state is the personal property of the leader and the leader's family. And monarchies were like this for many years, and tribes were like this, and the mafia is like this, organized crime is like this. That's usually how it's been until what's called bureaucratic proceduralism came along, otherwise known as the administrative state, where you have rules and institutions and bureaucracies and experts and constitutions. But that's all brand new, and Trump is a throwback to the old way of doing it.
Well, you note in your piece that that if you think of it this way, so it's no surprise that, he wants to be, run the Kennedy Center. He basically put himself as if he doesn't have enough to do. He's commander-in-chief of the armed forces, the titular head of NATO, the president of the United States. But that's not all. He wants to run basically he's going to be the postmaster general in everything but name only if he gets his way. He's now running the White House Correspondents Association. He's taken upon himself to decide who gets to be in the pool. So, but this fits that kind of leader, doesn't it?
Yeah, the key to patrimonialism, people say, some people say he's an authoritarian, a dictator, and that's not quite right. Because classic authoritarianism, that's the Hitler Mussolini thing, the Stalin thing.
Or Vladimir Putin.
They set up, well, Putin in the second half of his rule, we'll come to that. But in the first part of his rule, like the first 10 or so years, it's not like classic authoritarianism where they're setting up these giant crushing bureaucracies, secret police, propaganda agencies, special military forces, politburos, that whole crushing mechanism of Orwell. It's very different because instead it's all about personal loyalty to the guy at the top. That's how the appointments are done. They don't like bureaucracies. They don't like process. Those things are not loyal to them. It's all about the personalization to that individual and that individual's family. And that's exactly what Trump is doing.
So when Liz Cheney says, a fierce critic of Donald Trump, that this is the cult of personality. Now she means that as it's not a complimentary thing, but that if you're thinking about it this way, she's literally correct.
Well, in a sense, because so the whole phrase patrimonialism, it's too many syllables to even pronounce. But where it comes from is Weber's observation that usually the head of state, the boss, whether it's the mafia, the government, the tribe, the street gang, will present himself, it's almost always a him, as the symbolic father of the state, the personification of the state. I am the state, I am the protector of the state and of the people, I'm your father. And so in that sense, yeah, she's on to something, cult of personality or personification or personalization, but it's in the right ballpark.
Well, I don't even know that Donald Trump, if he was sitting here, would disagree with you.
No.
He quoted the other day, he quoted Napoleon,
Yeah.
talking about, he who saves the state, he can't be faulted. He is the state. He also said, I am the state. Napoleon said this. He was mimicking King Louis, who he had replaced. And it's this idea that what you're saying, it is the personification. So, but America's never had anybody like that, has it?
Well, we've had this at state levels and local levels. We had Huey Long.
I was going to ask you about Huey Long.
Yeah, he's an interesting figure. I don't know all that much about him, but he was the personification of government in Louisiana. We had this in some of the old political machines, which were very loyal to the boss. And some of the machines like Tammany were institutionalized.
Right.
And the bosses would come and go, but the institutions would outlast them. But the whole progressive movement was about replacing the personification of government with the bureaucratization of government. And all countries around the world, the major countries did that, because you can't really run a modern state as the personal projection of a single individual. You've got to have expert bureaucracies to run a modern economy, and especially a modern military. And if you sack everyone who's not loyal to you, you're winding up with a very low capacity government.
All right. I don't disagree with that, but I'm going to ask you a devil's advocate question about it. But first, I want to reintroduce you. I'm talking to Jonathan Rauch, a writer for The Atlantic, who's written a provocative piece in this current issue of The Atlantic. I urge you to go read it. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief, RealClearPolitics. Jonathan, one of the reasons Trump's been able to pull this off is that a critical mass of Americans, a majority or a working majority, have come to the conclusion that the bureaucracy grew too powerful and was too unresponsive and existed to serve itself. This blob, these millions of people that are just, and that one political party, the Democratic Party, actually both political parties, were just pouring money, borrowing money to keep themselves in power and keep themselves fat and happy and keep the system running, and that they lost track of what was good about having a permanent civil service? Yes or no?
Well, I don't know if you want to get into the election. I think mostly it was about people thought Biden was a failed president, and they didn't like high prices, and they didn't like the fact that there was a war in Europe, and they didn't like the painful retreat in Afghanistan, and they couldn't be fooled into thinking that Kamala Harris was not the vice president of a failed administration. So I don't really think that they understood, or really, frankly, that you or I understood that when Trump got in, he would not treat this as an opportunity to focus on those issues that the public was upset about, like prices and the border, restoring a sense of success and normalcy. I don't think they thought they would get a single person arrogating to himself the Kennedy Center, the White House press corps, smashing the bureaucracy, replacing it with cronies, taking the law into his own hands. I just don't think that's what they were voting for, but maybe I'm wrong.
No, I hear you, and I guess the midterm elections will give us a chance maybe to judge, what they think of what he's doing. This idea though that personal loyalty. I mean, now here's a question. Well, it's not really a question; it's an observation, but you can comment on it. If this is their criterion, you're going to run out of people, and it seems to me they may have run out of people rather quickly. He got rid of the head of the National Archives, and Trump was angry at the archives, and let's just stipulate for the sake of argument that he had a reason to be. They criminalized a case that maybe should have been settled civilly or in civil court or in another way. But the person he sacked, Colleen Shogan, had nothing to do with that. She wasn't there then when that's happened. And David Rubenstein, who he got rid of at the Kennedy Center, who was close to Biden, had given money to these organizations, including National Archives. He gets rid of these people. What does he end up with? A 31-year-old person who he's bringing in, who apparently is going to be he's trying to groom him to be the next head of the archives. He's the ranking person there now. He's had one job. It was at the Nixon Foundation since high school. He's not an archivist nor a historian, and he's in charge of the National Archives. I guess what I'm suggesting is that he's going to run out of competent people pretty quickly if personal loyalty is the only thing.
Well, he doesn't want competent people. He wants people loyal to him, and that means you go for the nobody who owes him their entire career. And you go for people who don't have their own expert constituencies. You don't want that. They're loyal to their reputation. There are two fatal flaws with patrimonialism. The reason that it disappeared in the United States and a lot of other Western countries, the first is it is invariably incompetent for all the reasons you're talking about. Competence is a bug, not a feature in that system. And second, it's always and everywhere corrupt. I mean, by definition, it's corrupt because it's replacing the rule of rules that are impersonal and treat people the same way with the rule of the ruler, who, of course, is interested in his own well-being and that of his family. And that's its downfall. If you look at Putin, the first half of his career as leader of Russia was patrimonialism. It was a gangster state. He owned the country, but if you stayed on his good side, you were okay. His most dangerous enemy was a guy named Navalny, who went after him for corruption and could have thrown him over if Putin had not arranged for his arrest, imprisonment, and death. And that's going to be a problem for Trump too. We are going to see a lot of corruption, and a lot of people are not going to like it.
Well, that's a depressing note. So, but let me return this one thing though. Is there anything that people you and I know have covered, James Comey and these other people who ran these institutions who had the right credentials? Is there anything they did that helped bring this moment about that that they shouldn't have done, that they should have, that this is a reaction to something that wasn't working?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think obviously institutions make mistakes, but switching out our 200+ year constitutional system for patrimonial pre-modern rule, I don't think anything those people did requires this type of remedy.
Well, it's a hell of an experiment we're undergoing. Jonathan Rauch, thank you for being with me. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief of RealClearPolitics. You've been listening to RCP on SiriusXM Radio, POTUS Channel 124, and we'll see you again tomorrow.